Greetings, traveler. Have you ever wanted to make a realistic video game, trying to model as much of the reality as possible into a fun game experience, only to find yourself going deeper and deeper into a swamp of parameters, comparisons, and just real life that is basically impossible to completely implement in a game? I certainly have been there earlier on in my career, and what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how we can, in an easy and easy to navigate way, I suppose, of implementing realistic objects from real life into games without losing the sense of realism, particularly when it comes to game balance. So, implementing real objects without having it being completely simulation style, where we try to model all parameters of the object, and not being very light-hearted, cartoony, kind of like in a Super Mario light-hearted way. So still maintaining some of that realism. If you don't know who I am, my name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for 14 years now. I've worked on games like FIFA and Dragon Quest and Idolmaster, to name a few. And something that always comes up, especially when we want to work on a new project, is if it's going to be something that models real life to a certain extent, then how far do we want to go, and how does that affect game balance? Sorry for the siren. There's always at least a few whenever I try to stream anything, so that's part of realism there for you. So, in this case, I'm taking a look at the World of Warships, not to go into the mechanics of this particular game, but as a visual example. So, let's say that we wanted to make a game that features real life objects like this battleship here. Well, the pitfalls in this situation, particularly when it comes to game balance, is that if we want to have a good sense of balance in the game while maintaining the realism, then the objects in the game, so the ship in this case, would have to behave as close as possible to real life. So the moment it stops behaving as close as possible, and we're prioritizing the speed of action or dramatic gameplay and so on, then the game might start feeling more and more arcadey and not very close to real life. On the other hand, if we try to stick to all of the realism, then we find out that there's just way too many parameters to keep track of. So if we wanted to implement everything that a real battleship has parameters wise, then the size and the range of the cannons and so on wouldn't be enough, right? You would need to track the number of crew members, where they are on the ship, what they eat on their ship, what their outfits are and what they mean, how much fuel the ship has, how much ammunition it has on board, when it was loaded, where is the next reload port. I mean, it's a real life object, so the connections are infinite. Is this all really necessary, though, to create a fun gaming experience? Well, what I found is that the answer completely depends on the scope of the game. So, the scope of what we want to show to the player in this particular game, in other words, the contract that we make with the player about what the player needs to do in order to find the fun that we have built into the game. So the thing that we want to highlight the most. So to give you an example, World of Warships wants to focus entirely on the open battle between groups of ships. So yes, you could implement fuel and ammunition and all these other things, but for this tightly defined scope, they have made the judgment that they don't want to track any more parameters than the speed of the ship and the turning angle of the cannons and those things. So how can we use a similar approach when we're designing something completely new, to not get bogged down too much with everything that's possible to track, but still stay realistic? Well, let's say that in our game we also want to implement a battleship like this one, and it would be a battleship taken from real life. So here the goals are to keep it realistic, for one, so make it recognizable to people who see it inside the game and relatable to what it is in real life. So in other words, make sure it has basically the same shape, the same size, compared to other objects in the world, the scale is right, and it has the main key features. And of course the key features of the battleship are the guns, how often they fire, how quickly they turn, how much damage they do, and so on. So in this point, something I want to highlight is the tendency of the game to be realistic. So not a simulation. We're not trying to make a mathematical or scientific simulation of absolutely everything about the ship that we want to use in our game. And we don't want the game to be described as arcade or, light-hearted or something like that. So if we made the ship move, I don't know, 10 times faster than its normal speed or 100 times faster, then of course that would immediately break this realistic sense, and it would be a different kind of game. Same for the guns. If the guns fired constantly, with no delay at all between the shots, then we either have to explain some amazing technology that makes all of this possible, or we would have to tone it down a bit to move it closer to realism. So with that being said, what's the practical way of implementing something from real life to our game without tracking infinite parameters and without losing the sense of realism? Well, what I found is that based on the scope of our game and what actions are possible, so let's say we want to implement the traveling aspect, perhaps between islands, perhaps between different ports inside the game. Of course, we want to implement combat, and we also, let's say, want to keep track of the crew of the ship. Let's say that for us it's important to keep track of who is on the ship, what their skills are, what their career path looks like, how we can develop them further by taking them on missions and so on. So of course, just with these three areas of gameplay, you could go infinitely deep, but let's keep it pretty simple, and let's stay focused on how we can keep it realistic without counting too many parameters or implementing too many parameters, I suppose. So for the traveling aspect, we can indeed use the ship of the real life counterpart of the ship as it is. Since this will be the centerpiece of our game, then making sure that speed is basically whatever you would have in real life is not only easy, but it's a quick way to make sure we establish this realistic connection to the real life object without too much work on our side. And of course, anybody who sees the ship in motion inside the game would think that this game is aiming for a realistic approach rather than a I don't know, Hollywood-style dramatic or overly simplistic approach. So that's a good start for us. What else can we get from the real-life object that's convenient and good for us to use? The size, the scale, some of the main features of the ship are definitely going to work in our favor, and they don't force us to do too much work to justify it inside the game. Making the shape the same as the real-life object is something that's going to increase immersion for the game, so that works for us, and the scale and so on. And it also shows the approach that we want to take to the game. So if the ship was the looks of the ship were closer to the realistic image, that works for us. If it was more cartoony, it would go towards the arcade direction. If it had I don't know, super realistic graphics and crew members visibly working on the ship and seagulls sitting on the mast or whatever, then we would go further into the simulation direction, which could be an interesting direction to take. Depends on what you want to do. So that covers the looks and the travel part. So we have the speed. We would of course have to implement the ports in an equal fashion. So again, realistic, not necessarily simulation, and have some objectives for the ship to achieve going between these ports. And of course we come to the battle aspect of the game. Now World of Warships implements battle in its own way, and for a new project we could stay close to that, or we could take a massively different approach. For example, instead of having the firing of the cannons from a third person perspective, or from an entirely zoomed in aiming camera, I suppose, we could instead take the approach of managing the crew in each turret. So the people who are carrying the shells, turning the weapon, receiving the fire orders, making sure that they are in sync, making sure that no one delays the action, that maximum precision is achieved. Kind of like a pit stop in Formula One, I suppose. Everybody is doing their job at the right time. This is one approach we could take. Or we could keep the same approach as World Warships, keep it very simple, just point and shoot kind of approach. Again, it depends on how deeply we would like to go into this direction. Now here comes the interesting part. When we are done with this basic setup of the ship and our game, then we want to make sure that game balance is served by this realistic approach and it's not encumbered by it. And by encumbered, I mean we don't have too many variables to check, so that by making sure that all these variables match the variables in real life, the game falls out of balance. So that means that if we try to fix part of the parameters to behave in an interesting and a fun way inside the game, the other part of the parameters that we didn't adjust hold us back. So for example, perhaps you want to have this epic long journey and fight several ships along the way, but your fuel says that you wouldn't be able to do it in one full load of fuel, and you would have to stop somewhere for refueling. So that might stop our realism streak and our approach of doing combat like that. For the combat itself, so that means that we will have to limit how many of these parameters of the real objects we want to count to make sure that it serves the game balance, right? So for battle itself, so two ships shooting at each other. Again, this is an area where many games can make it feel like our vehicle is way stronger or way weaker than its real life counterpart. So this happens often in games, for example, with two human fighters, I guess, punching each other. And you might think that, a normal real life human would only take, just a couple of punches before being knocked out. Seasoned fighters might take 5 to 10, but there's no way you could take a hit with an axe to the face, for example, and survive that, kind of like in the Mortal Kombat series or something extreme like that. Of course, those games are aiming for an entirely different experience, so that's fine. But just to keep the link with reality going. So what that means for our ship here is that when two ships of, let's say, the same kind would do battle, then one good area to examine is, well, how many hits would a real life battleship take before it's sunk? So, and it's particularly good to compare this ship against itself, because it will set a really, really good baseline for us. So let's say we do our real world research, and by the way, I don't know the answer for this particular ship, but this is how I would go about it. So we would do our real world research and see, based on the thickness of the armor and the strength of the shells and the accuracy, I suppose, of the guns at standard range, so maybe somewhere around the middle range. What's the expected number of hits that would take that it would take to sink a ship of the same type? And of course it's going to be a range, right? It's never going to be a fixed price, like 5 hits or something like that. Perhaps a super lucky hit in a critical spot would be enough to sink the ship. I don't know. But again, we want to as much as possible avoid these outliers, because here we want to also make sure that the expectation of the player is served, right? If a player was sailing the ship and then just some stray shell took out his ship in just one hit of a single shell, then that would feel strange for the player being one shot in that situation from full health, right? So you want to make sure that we stay realistic and we are fun at the same time. We keep the game fun at the same time. We don't prevent, the realism doesn't prevent people from having fun. They still feel that, you know, they have a fighting chance. So that would mean that when we come up with that range, which could be, let's say, just as a sample here, we decide that 5 to 10 hits should be able to sink an identical ship to ours. Then, based on the research we did on the real world, right? Then we have a baseline for what to expect inside the game. So when we have this comparison here, and we say that with 5 to 10 hits on target from a ship, we should be able to sink the enemy ship. Then, of course, we playtest this to make sure it behaves as we expect. And then, based on this baseline, we have the next super elegant and super useful aspect of game design here, is that now we know what the expected behavior is between a matchup, between two identical ships of this type. So the benefit here is that when the time comes to create our second type of ship, which could be, you know, bigger, it could be smaller, it could have, let's say, stronger armor but weaker guns, something like that, then we also know what to expect of the ship's game balance wise. So if the new ship that we're making has way more armor, for example, than this particular ship, then the natural expectation would be that it would take more hits from this ship to defeat the heavy armor ship. It just follows logic. Now, how that scales, again, depends on how deeply you want to go into the real life research, but this baseline allows us to do this kind of comparison and keep things within the sphere of realistic. Now, it's still a video game and there's still power creep coming up, and a video game only can model part of reality, right? Not absolutely everything in reality. And just like with any game in general, it only focuses on a subset of reality to show us something that's to be learned. So chess, for example, models a battlefield, right? But it couldn't possibly model thousands and thousands of troops charging across the battlefield fighting with each other. Instead, chess is only trying to teach us the importance of strategy, priorities, what you protect versus what you're willing to risk, that aspect of that situation. So just like chess, in our game we couldn't possibly focus on every single aspect of this conflict. Instead, let's say we think that the survival and the battles that you do along a slightly more extended journey, so something longer than what you play as in World of Warships, that's what we want to focus on. Not just the battle, but the journey aspect and the survival aspect as well. Perhaps even the crew management aspect. So because that's what the game wants to focus on, and the game creator would want to highlight the fun aspect and the pleasure of doing this the right way, I suppose, would be for the player, then only the parameters relevant to that experience would have to be modeled. So again, the speed of the ship, the capacity for crew, the fuel capacity, the strength of the guns, and so on. So in a nutshell, that's all we need to do. That's all we need to focus on to make sure that we maintain these two principles, right? That what we have in game has a striking resemblance to what someone would observe in the real world, and it doesn't lose any of the fun, any of the usability of using it inside the game due to its realism. Realism serves the game and not the other way around, because the game ultimately should be a good experience in itself. We're not trying to recreate reality in the game, because reality already exists. Anyway, that's it for today. That's a brief dive into how realism can be included in a game, not to make us track absolutely everything there is about the real life object, but to serve fun, to create the connection with reality and let the player enjoy it, particularly when it comes to game balance and how that can be tuned to let the player have fun. Anyway, that's it for today. Let me know if you find yourself in this kind of situation where you have to model all these parameters and it can seem like a huge task at times, and I'll be sure to reply and leave my thoughts as well. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have fun.